Hello and welcome to a double edition of Iain Dale All Talk and the Iain Dale Book Club podcast. Today we're going to talk to a politician who's held a number of cabinet jobs. He was Defence Secretary for 6 years, which is almost the longest in history. I don't know if you can guess who the longest serving Defence Secretary was. Well done. It's Dennis Healey. He was in the New Labour cabinet in various roles, and he's Geoff Hoon. Welcome. And you've written an autobiography, Geoff, which is why we're talking to you today. 11 years after you left Parliament. Why is it taking you so long?
I think that's a very good question, and there's no real defence to that, save that I just didn't have the time, and I suspect publishers have been inundated in the past few months with manuscripts of finished books that lots of people promised to do and never quite got around to, but lockdowns allowed for us all to finish these projects, and I did.
They often say that an autobiography is a work of fiction about oneself. Was it important to you to get your record of history on the record? Because there's quite a few bits in the book where you possibly give a bit of a different interpretation to that which people may have been left with.
Deep down, I'm a historian. I did history for my entrance exam to university, and I do think it's important that, in a sense, I had my say. I don't necessarily expect everyone to agree with my interpretation, but there are other interpretations out there, and I simply wanted to add to the confusion.
Well, it is interesting to read it, particularly all the sort of the political years, comparing what you say to Alistair Campbell, to Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, etc. So we'll come on to that period a little bit later. But you were almost a reluctant politician, it seemed to me, that you started off in the law, and yet your background would suggest that you wouldn't have ended up in the law or politics.
No, and I guess I'm part of that considerable generation of the 60s and 70s that benefited from very generous financial support to go to university. I was the first person in my entire extended family to stay on at school after the school leaving age. So it was university that, in a sense, propelled me into the law. I went into the law really because I had no background in it. I'd never met a lawyer before I decided to study the law. It simply seemed to be something that if at the end of it I liked it, there would be a job and a career, and that proved to be the case.
There's quite a few moments in the book where I think that you don't actually say it, but you appear to me to be suffering from imposter syndrome a bit, that you can't quite believe that a boy from the East Midlands has got to where you've got to.
I think that is true. I mean, I do tell a story of coming to London with my dad, who was a railwayman, and going past Parliament on a double-decker bus and never imagining that I would one day walk through those gates as of right. So yes, but having said that, you change, you develop, you have experiences, and in a sense, I hope the book conveys that change and that process that happens to everyone in whatever walk of life they pursue.
Tell me a bit about your upbringing.
My dad was a railwayman. He only really had two jobs. One was as a volunteer in the Second World War in the Royal Air Force, and then for the rest of his life on the railway in Derby. My mother met him while she also worked on the railway. So we had a modest upbringing, I think it's fair to say. I've read Alan Johnson's book, and he describes a friend who actually, I think by coincidence, his father did work on the railway, and because that was a regular job, they had a regular income. So they were just that bit ahead of the Johnsons. But certainly money was very tight when I was growing up.
And what did you think you would end up doing when you were growing up?
Well, certainly my dad was asked that question once at a birthday party, and almost inevitably he said he thought that I would work on the railway because historically there were two jobs in Derby. One was working for the railway and the other was working for Rolls-Royce. My dad worked on the railway and my uncle worked for Rolls-Royce, so it would have been in that sort of area, I'm sure.
And you kind of ended up working on the railway in a sense when you were Transport Secretary, I suppose. It's interesting. When I got to that chapter, I thought, you've got two things in common with Chris Grayling. One, in that you had to do Prime Minister's questions once, and he was asking the questions for the Conservatives. But he always wanted to be Secretary of State for Transport because he was fascinated by trains and all the other different aspects of it. And when you were appointed, you were actually quite pleased in a funny sort of way to get that job.
Well, it did seem appropriate. I can remember once seeing an advert for a lawyer to work for British Rail, and I thought that was probably the job that I was destined for, in a sense. So getting that position was certainly hugely appropriate for someone with my kind of background.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When did you first... What's your first political memory?
Very much the debate about arms sales to South Africa. In the very early 60s, I was only 7 or 8. And I think it made me think about the fundamentals in a way that probably up until then I hadn't done. And the fundamentals were, why was it that someone was discriminated against, couldn't vote, couldn't sit in the same room as someone else who had a different coloured skin? And I've just read a book about the judicial system in the south of the United States, and I'm a great enthusiast for the United States, but the way that black people were treated in the South, in America and in South Africa, simply offended my very basic instincts about fairness and justice.
At the age of 7 or 8, see, that's quite something, I think, for a child that's young to even comprehend all of that.
I'm not pretending that I had a well-worked-out answer or I came to any conclusions, but there was something fundamentally wrong as I thought it through.
And do you think that was what turned you into somebody who was always going to be on the left? I asked that because I was trying to think when the first time I came across all the South African issue, and I think it was actually at university where there was a no platform policy and boycott of Barclays. This was in the early 1980s, but I don't think I was aware of it until I was 18, 10 years after you.
Well, things change. I can just vividly recall this seemed to be an issue almost every day at the time, and it was something that made me think through the principles. I'm not pretending I had any great insight. It was simply about the way in which one human being treated another, and it just seemed to me fundamentally wrong.
Because you talk in the book about your parents who were working class conservatives. What did they make of your political awakening?
They were not impressed. I think it's fair to say that my mother, who's 90 or almost 91, is still not impressed. So they were people who believed that you got on by hard work, by looking after yourself and your family. They were great people. They were hard workers. They always did the right thing. They had very, very strong principles and values. I just didn't agree with all of them.
What did they make of your political career?
I think they were pretty puzzled to begin with, because the other aspect of working class conservatives is that they tend to be, sounds like a criticism, and I don't mean it in this way, but they tend to be very deferential. So I can recall having a discussion where my name was in the local newspaper in the days when there were local newspapers, and being asked, well, why were you doing that? And I said, well, it's my job. It's what I do. I tell people what I think and what should happen. And they couldn't really quite accommodate that because it really wasn't for them.
And when you were in the cabinet and the top of politics, did they share in that in any way? Did they come down to sort of big receptions? What did they make of your life at that point?
I think they were, well, I hope they were proud, and as all parents would be in those circumstances. And certainly one of my proudest moments was my dad coming down for the remembrance event at the Albert Hall, and he rose to become a leading aircraftman in the Second World War, and a man called Sir Peter Squire, now sadly died, but was Chief of the Air Staff, a delightful man who I worked very closely with over a number of years, sat and talked to my dad, and I was really very impressed by, certainly Peter Squire, who was a delightful man, but at the same time seeing these two men talking together about their love of the RAF.
How did you get on at university?
To begin with, I found it quite strange, quite difficult. Having said that, I passed all the necessary examinations. I wasn't intimidated by it, at least not intellectually. I think the intimidation came with the realization that there were people from very, very different backgrounds from mine. I grew up in a small town in the mid to late 1960s where I think there was a real sense of equality and opportunity, virtually full employment at the time. I did not detect in that small town extremes of wealth, or for that matter, extremes of poverty. I mean, clearly there were people that I went to school with who were less well off, but nevertheless, that small town seemed relatively consistent across the board, whereas Cambridge, there were people there who had significant amounts of money, certainly as far as I was concerned, who had a student grant. And that made me realise that there was a very different world out there that at some stage I had to get to grips with.
But did you ever feel out of place?
There was a time initially, certainly, where people would make fun of my flat vowels. I was still saying bath and grass. I think I still say bath and grass, but maybe I've learned to accommodate it a little. And certainly I was made fun of when I tried to speak in meetings. But even that I didn't find easy because I'm not a natural public speaker.
Well, that was something actually that really came through in the book, that you never had any confidence about your public speaking at all. But how did you get to be more comfortable with it? Because you say, well, I was never going to be an orator. But I don't remember thinking sort of that you're a bad speaker.
I just had to force myself, is the short answer. I tell a story in the book about going to a student meeting in Cambridge and thinking that there were 2 or 3 things that needed to be said in the course of this particular debate. Not saying them because I just could not force myself to get up on my feet and say it. And someone else said exactly those things, and I was furious with myself that I had the ideas. And if you'd have spoken to my friends at the time, they'd have said, we can't keep him quiet. But I couldn't bring myself to do it in public. And by that anger with myself, the next time I forced myself to speak, and so it went on. And gradually I overcame those nerves and that anxiety. But in some ways I've not regretted that nervousness, because I think it makes you a better speaker that you spend your time thinking about what you're going to say. I don't know whether I mentioned this in the book, but I know for one of my first speeches in Parliament, I sat there in the days when new members had to wait to the end before they were called, after all of the Privy Councillors and all the other people were called. And I'd got an outline of a speech, which mostly was crossed out by the time I'd finished because someone else had made the point or someone had said something better. And I think that nervousness is not a bad thing, because I've seen so many people in Parliament speak without thinking and not be very impressive as a result. So second-guessing everything that you say is not a bad thing, actually.
There's a great anecdote that you've got about an event that you were speaking at with Neil Kinnock, and you had to introduce him. And you literally said about 3 sentences and sat down, and he turned to you and said, "Is that it?"
That's absolutely right.
And then he went on for about 3 hours.
He looked at me he was shocked. He really genuinely shocked, because if I said 3 sentences, that was about it. Whereas he had this just wonderful gift. But it was a wonderful gift that on that occasion, at any rate, he probably just went on for a little bit too long. And he was a wonderful, wonderful speaker. And I think had he have been a 19th century politician, he would always have been a favourite of everyone.
Have you ever had a moment, though, where you've been giving a speech and you just thought, I've got these people, they are completely getting me, I'm enjoying myself, I don't feel this is a bit of a trial? Have you felt that?
I think I have. There have been occasions, yes, when I felt comfortable. One of the problems about being a minister is that, well, I think it's a problem, I don't know whether it's still a problem, certainly for me it was a problem, that it wasn't exactly a script. but it was necessary to stay fairly clearly on side, otherwise there would be some repercussions. So the opportunities for speaking that I've enjoyed are really mostly when perhaps speaking after dinner or amongst people that I know well, where I don't, where I can relax and simply say what I think, like today maybe.
Do you often wonder what would have happened if you had stayed in the law? Because you've got some quite interesting anecdotes about your initial career, certainly at Chambers in Nottingham, where, you tell the story. It's where the guy in charge of the Chambers seemed, when you were working for him, seemed to really support you and then just cut you loose.
It was an extremely competitive environment, although I probably didn't appreciate that when I first began, and therefore once I got onto my feet, and because I was a little older than the typical pupil barrister, and because I was local and had a local accent, and the local solicitors rather liked that, so actually I got going really very quickly. But the head of Chambers wasn't so keen on that, and made sure that I was kept back a little, which frustrated me, certainly.
And everyone always assumes that if you're a barrister, you must be incredibly rich. But I think you do a very good job in the book of explaining, well, that's not actually the case, certainly initially. And depending on what kind of law you specialise in, it might never be the case.
I think it's still a very tough profession for someone from modest background to aspire to, and perhaps even tougher today because, as I said earlier, I had the benefit of very generous financial support through university. So I didn't finish university with a huge debt. I finished university kind of as I'd started. At the bar, you're not allowed to earn money in your second 6 months of training, of pupillage as it's known.
Is that still the case?
As far as I'm aware, I've never...
Because that's a huge barrier to entry for people from a modest background.
Most chambers would say that they give scholarships, and there's certainly some help. But again, one of the things that I look back on, slightly wry amusement, is that I never imagined I could afford to live in London because the costs of living in London compared to the East Midlands were enormous, and therefore I didn't see myself gravitating to London from Cambridge as most of my contemporaries did.
And at that point you got married to Elaine, and you sort of thought about going into politics, and you ended up being selected as an MEP candidate, which she wasn't particularly impressed with.
That is absolutely an understatement. I mean, she had given up a great deal of security when I moved from the academic world into the bar. She supported my very early period because she was teaching at the time, and for me then to throw up what looked like an extremely, and by then was an extremely successful career for the uncertainties of politics was not something that she had in her game plan.
And you did the classic thing of saying, oh, don't worry, I won't be selected, and then of course you were.
Well, not only did I tell her that I wouldn't be selected, I told her I wouldn't be elected because in 1984 the Labour Party was still in a bad place after the era of Michael Foot and the rise of the hard left, and more than anything, I think actually it was Neil Kinnock driving the Labour Party forward that allowed me to win what was a very marginal seat in Derbyshire and Ashfield, and in a sense that was the start of it all. But if Elaine were giving this interview, I assure you she would still not have forgiven me.
And in a sense it was quite an achievement, because you were a pro-European candidate in what was then still a Eurosceptic party, because in '83 Labour had fought the election on coming out of the common market. So why do you think you got that selection?
I wouldn't go quite as far as saying that the party was Eurosceptic. I think maybe some of the leading lights, I think maybe some of the activists, but actually I would say there was still a huge number of pro-Europeans, and my pitch was basically, look, we are a pro-European party. We've been through this process. It's now time that we made a change. And that went down extremely well, much to my surprise, I might say.
And you quite enjoyed your time in the European Parliament, didn't you?
I did. Deep down, I think anyone on the left must be an internationalist, must believe in cooperation with other countries, trying to work together to solve problems. And I found the European Parliament a remarkable place, although at the time it often, and still is, was criticised for being a talking shop. But actually, I could go there and I could meet people from a variety of different countries. We would discuss how we would approach common problems, and we could adopt their solutions or we could reject them, but at least there were people there who'd been through it before, and I found that an incredible process, and I still think that the European Parliament is a much underrated institution.
But you always wanted to get into the House of Commons. That was your eventual aim.
I think the worm of ambition was eating away at me, yes, and it was a logical next step. Although again, it wasn't the easiest transition. Not that many people have made that move from the European Parliament to the House of Commons. But I guess once I was there and I realised that real decisions and real opportunities took place here in London rather than in Brussels or Strasbourg, then it was the place to be.
And you succeeded Frank Haynes in Ashfield. Now, I don't know how many people listening to this or watching this will remember Frank Haynes, but I remember him from the mid-1980s as one of the real characters of the House of Commons. He and Margaret Thatcher had a bit of a thing, didn't they? She rather liked him, even though he was about as far away from her as you could possibly get. That they always had quite a good bit of repartee. Just tell us a little about him and what were the challenges in the selection process succeeding somebody like Frank?
Well, first of all, he was a wonderful man. He was generous and kind and went out of his way as a constituency MP to help people in Ashfield. So that was a huge challenge right from the word off. He also, as you say, was a real character. I think he referred to Margaret Thatcher as me duck in a very East
Which, coming from the East Midlands, she would appreciate.
Which, coming from the East Midlands, although the thing about Frank, that he wasn't from the East Midlands.
Oh, right.
He was actually a Bevan boy who came from London originally and was sent up in the Second World War to work in the mines, where he met his wife and began a dynasty in and around Ashfield. I think the party probably locally were looking for a complete contrast, which of course they got. But nevertheless, Frank would be out on a Saturday evening leafleting with my leaflets rather than his own. He and his wife were tremendously supportive and hospitable. So he was a great man to follow. But one of the things that he always said, and I never forgot this, and Neil Kinnock once said something similar to me, Frank Haynes had been a whip for a time, and he said, I never, ever won a vote in the House of Commons, having been elected in 79 and leaving Parliament in 92. That was a long, long period of Labour defeat. And he wanted someone to succeed him who would not only win votes in the House of Commons, but might go on to ministerial office. And that was really, I think, why I was chosen.
Tell us what Parliament was like when you were first elected. I mean, the first day when you walked through the door, when you made your maiden speech, it's a very different place to 2021.
Yes, it is, although you will know far more about it in 2021 than I do, in the sense that I watch it on the TV, I watch the news, I'm still hooked on politics, as anybody who's been involved always will be. But it's not quite the same as being involved in a day-to-day way. So I think part of the problem initially in 1992 was, of course, the Labour Party had expected to win the 1992 election. So there was a letdown, and Neil Kinnock obviously felt that it was the right thing to stand aside. John Smith came in.
Just before we get to that, in the 92 election, you relate an anecdote about a voter that you met about a week before polling day, and that had a profound effect on you and made you think, oh, maybe we aren't going to win after all.
Well, you're quite right, and I should have mentioned that. I knocked on the door, clearly a council house, and a lady came to the door, very, very well dressed, very proper. But you could see in that glimpse you get when the door opens that her life was very, very modest. And if you remember, Labour had made only 2 promises in 1992, and one of them was to substantially improve the pension. And so I asked her whether she would be voting Labour, and she said very politely that she thought probably not. And I went into my candidate's routine of saying, well, we're going to increase the pension and you'll be much better off. And she looked at me for a moment and paused. And very politely, she said, I don't think the country can afford it. And it really made me realise that politics wasn't just about consumerism. It wasn't just about appealing to the lowest common denominator who gets the most out of it. It was actually genuinely about persuading people that we could do something for the country, and that it wasn't just enough to promise people money in their pocket, that actually they had a wider perspective of what was good for the country.
If only John McDonnell had met her in 2019.
It might have helped.
It might have done. So the 92 to 97 Parliament started, obviously a very difficult one for the Conservatives. You met Tony Blair and Gordon Brown fairly early on.
Yes, I did, although in odd circumstances. Actually, I think it was in the first time I met them both was just before. I'd met Tony, actually, on a visit to Brussels when he was Shadow Employment Secretary. So I sort of knew him, but not terribly well. I'd not met Gordon Brown before. I was actually looking for somewhere to live, and I bumped into them, and Gordon Brown was extremely helpful and guided me south of the river, which is a place I could afford rather than where initially I had been looking, which I knew I couldn't afford. So he was extremely kind and very generous. I also walked back with them after John Smith was elected as leader, entirely by chance. And it was clear to me in the sparkling conversation that took place between them that Gordon Brown was very much the senior partner in their relationship at the time. This was 1992, and he was fizzing with ideas and suggestions and what I should be doing, what Tony should be doing, what the party should be doing. He just was a bundle of intellectual brilliance.
And going through that Parliament, what I can't quite remember, what shadow roles did you have during that time?
Well, initially none, and although Jack Cunningham had tried to persuade his old friend John Smith that I should be promoted, John Smith was very old school. He thought you need to earn your time and work hard on the backbenches.
I'm with him.
And then, tragically, after he died, Tony Blair became leader, and
you presumably supported him.
Yes, and he wanted to change things, and he adopted initially. I'm sorry he didn't pursue it, but he initially adopted an idea which actually the Conservatives have always followed, which is that future ministers should spend some time in the Whip's office. So my first front bench position was as a Whip, which was controversial because at that time the Labour Whip's office was slightly concerned that all of these new Labour people were being parachuted into the Whip's office. But actually it was a good experience. I learned a great deal about working with colleagues, about managing majorities or lack of it in our case at the time. And I think it would have been sensible for Tony to continue that process, and I think it's always worked very, very well for the Conservatives. They have a way of doing things which I think recognises that ministers have served their time in the Whip's office, and that I think helps persuade colleagues when they might be inclined to do something other than what the government might want.
One of the things I found most fascinating about the book was all of the different reshuffles that took place, all the government appointments. And you've got so many stories to tell about your involvement in these, some positive, some not so. When the Blair government was first elected in 97, you thought that you were going to be Higher Education Minister, I think, which in a way you dodged a bullet by not being, but you weren't very pleased about the appointment you were given. Number 2 to Derry Irvine in the Lord Chancellor's office. Now, given that you had been a lawyer, I would have thought that would have been something that you would have enjoyed. Well, you did actually enjoy it in the end, but...
I certainly enjoyed it, and I loved working with Derry Irvine, who's a great man and was a huge influence on me. But at the time, when I was appointed, the Lord Chancellor's Department, as it was then, it's now subsumed into the Ministry of Justice, but the Lord Chancellor's Department did seem to be a bit of a political backwater. And moreover, I did seem to have been typecast as a lawyer, and I just couldn't see what I was going to do, not least because on my very first day in the department, the private secretary stayed on to see in the new minister, warned me that actually the big challenge will be to get anything to do at all, because he was used to a Lord Chancellor in the 92, 97 John Major government who really did everything, and there were no crumbs even on the table for the junior minister to do. So that's what I was expecting. What, of course, I hadn't realised was, first of all, how pivotal a figure Derry was in chairing a series of cabinet committees, how important the whole legislative process was for any government, and the fact that I was the number two equally meant that when Derry made a statement in the House of Lords, I had to get up and repeat it in the House of Commons, which was very good preparation for later life as a more senior minister.
And what was he like as a person? Because he does have a certain reputation for being quite overbearing, not having many people skills. Did you find that?
I guess my initial meeting with him might have suggested that. He expressed very clearly, and sorry, I should say, I had never ever met him before that first meeting, so I had little idea of what to expect. He made some observation about not really thinking that elected politicians were quite up to it, which wasn't the most delicate or diplomatic of introductions, but actually we got like a house on fire. I mean, I think he's one of his great skills is identifying your abilities and using them. And as soon as he realised that I could do a job and that I might be helpful, we got on extremely well.
He was a bit gaff-prone, though, wasn't he?
Sorry, a bit?
Gaff-prone.
Well, he certainly ran into difficulties, and but I think part of the problem was that he had not fought an election. He had not been through that process. He was, I think, right up until 97, still practicing quite hard at the bar and had a brilliant reputation for commanding detail. And I guess I shouldn't really speak for him, but I guess he probably thought that that command of detail was going to be useful in politics, as it was. And when he went through line by line proposals for legislation, he revealed all of the various problems that inevitably we were going to face as we launched this flagship legislation onto the water, because you know better than I do that if government legislation is not thought through, there are a huge range of people who will try and put holes in it. So one of the things that I think was underappreciated was the way in which he looked at legislation, as he probably looked at the law and looked at a case with a very fine eye for what could go wrong.
There was one instance where he announced something and you said, no, you've got this completely wrong. And in the end, well, you tell the story, because I think this is very illustrative of, I mean, he did have this reputation for being very overbearing and sort of, well, I'm always right. But this incident slightly belied that.
What you're referring to is some legislation actually that we'd inherited from the Conservatives. In the darling days of John Major's administration, there was a law commission proposal to reform the law of divorce. Normally speaking, law commission proposals go through on the nod. Nobody argues with reform of the law in that abstract sense. Towards the end of John Major's time, he could barely command a majority in the House of Commons, and a number of his Conservative MPs banded together to try and move this legislation in a direction they thought was necessary. And basically their thesis was the reason why there were lots of divorces was because it was too easy. So they had the idea that they should make divorce more difficult. And what was passed into law was a proposal to have what were called information meetings. So anybody who wanted to divorce in the first place had to go along, sign up for this meeting where they would be told about the financial difficulties, they would be told that their children would suffer if they were to divorce, and this was a prerequisite before anyone could divorce. Well, I'd had a close friend who'd been through a terrible time getting a divorce. It took him a long time to bring himself to do it. He had a daughter, and I knew that people did not divorce easily. And so I was dead against this particular proposal, and particularly at a time when we were still trying to work with the Conservative government's financial proposals. We did not have a lot of spare money, and spending tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions of pounds on organising these information meetings right across the country just thought was mad. But as a brand new, rather naive minister, I made a terrible mistake, and I told the civil servants what I thought, with the result that these papers suddenly stopped coming to me. It was a very Humphrey exercise as far as I was concerned. I had a wonderful private secretary by then, a new one, and he told me what was going on, that I'd been kept out of the loop because they knew I was dead against it. And at around the time of some of Derry's difficulties with the media, he signed this off. I honestly don't really think that he looked at it in the kind of detail that I think he would have done had he have not been under pressure elsewhere. But anyway, it was signed off as policy. And when I found out, I went to see him and had it out with him and said, look, this is nonsense. We haven't got the money. It doesn't work anyway. And why are we doing this? And to his enormous credit, and as you say, he has a very different public reputation sometimes, he listened to what I had to say, he looked at the proposals, and he said, right, you're absolutely correct about this, but it's gone through the cabinet. You are going to have to explain this to the Prime Minister. You know, there was either junior minister for paper clips in the Lord Chancellor's department.
Empty stomach moment.
And I suddenly marched across to Downing Street to sit with Tony Blair as Prime Minister and his mentor, the Lord Chancellor, to tell the Prime Minister that the Lord Chancellor has got it wrong and that I'd got it right. It was definitely a heart-in-the-mouth moment.
Do you think that was... I mean, OK, Tony Blair knew who you were before that, but do you think that was the moment where you really made your mark with him?
I don't know. I think it certainly helped. One of the things I always found with Tony Blair, and despite, again, you know, some different perceptions sometimes in the world, if you explained your case to him clearly, openly and fairly, I never had the slightest difficulty. I'm not saying he always agreed with me, but he was open to argument and listened to argument, thought about it, and would come back and give you the answer.
There are a couple of occasions in the book where you describe a prime ministerial bollocking from Tony Blair. Now, I can't imagine him administering a bollocking. What did that feel like? How did it happen?
Well, it was very polite. I'm not pretending that I got shouted at, but I knew that I was made to feel very uncomfortable. And actually, if you think about it, bollockings where you're made to feel uncomfortable because you know you're in the wrong and you've been caught out, they're more difficult than somebody simply shouting at you, because the reaction of most people when you get shouted at is to shout back at them.
Even if they're Prime Minister.
Even if they're Prime Minister.
Now, let's move on to when you were appointed Defence Secretary. I think that appointment was your fourth different appointment in like 6 months or something, wasn't it? Because where did you went to be Europe Minister?
I started out 2000. No, sorry, get me getting the dates right. I started out in 1999 in the Lord Chancellor's department, having failed to be moved during one of the various reshuffles. I then was moved to the Foreign Office initially with responsibility for the Middle East and the Far East, including Iraq, which was interesting. 2 months later, I became the Europe Minister. And was Europe Minister right through the summer, but never actually appeared in Parliament as Minister for Europe. And then in October, so 3 or 4 months later, I became the Defence Secretary. So yes, I'd had 4 jobs in 4 or 5 months.
Did you feel qualified to be Defence Secretary?
I'm not sure modern politicians are automatically qualified to be Defence Secretary. You rightly mentioned Dennis Healy earlier, a man with a military cross, the beach master at Anzio, a man with a very distinguished military career who followed military matters and defence matters, was the longest serving Defence Secretary. I mean, these are men from a generation who served, and very few modern members of Parliament have that experience. And therefore, obviously, I went into it absolutely determined to live up to the ideals that my father had given me, who volunteered, even though he was in a reserved occupation. So I think Charles Guthrie, who was the Chief of the Defence Staff, said I had the right attitude, even though perhaps I didn't have the right qualifications.
Obviously, Afghanistan and Iraq dominate your 6 years as Defence Secretary. Where were you on the 11th of September 2001?
I just opened the first major defence exhibition that took place at the Excel Conference Centre. It still goes on every other year. I'd given a speech, toured the stands, had a quick lunch, and came out to find my driver unusually standing by the car. And he told me straight away that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. Initially, for a few minutes at any rate, everyone assumed that some terrible accident had taken place. But very quickly, as the second plane went into the second of the towers, it was obvious that something much more sinister had occurred.
So you immediately went back to the MOD. And it seemed to me from reading your account of this that you were fairly quick to realise that nothing would be the same again.
I think my first response, very clearly, was that we had to be ready for the inevitable request that I knew would come from the United States for assistance. I'd lived in the United States. I still have more family there than I have here. And no American president could survive public opinion in the United States unless he or she one day had responded to that kind of attack on American soil. So I knew that there would be an American response, and it was absolutely clear to me that we would stand alongside the United States in whatever endeavour they embarked upon.
Tony Blair was at the TUC. He came back to London. When was the first time that you talked to him about it?
I think there were some ad hoc meetings that evening, although I'd had meetings in the MOD with my idea about preparing for the American request, which I think some of the senior military figures also recognised. To be fair and to be entirely accurate, most of the rest of that day and the few days thereafter were really about protecting the UK from what we thought was going to be an attack on the United Kingdom, indeed on other parts of the world. So much of the emphasis in the meetings in Downing Street and elsewhere was really about protecting the United Kingdom. The meetings that I had in the MOD were beginning to be about what contribution we could make to an American military operation in Afghanistan.
And when did Iraq first appear on your radar as Defence Secretary? Because it wouldn't have just been before the 2003 invasion. Because I seem to remember a remark in the book where you said to somebody that actually Iraq is a bigger problem than Afghanistan.
Iran, yeah.
Sorry, Iran, yeah.
Yeah, well, I didn't actually say to someone. I actually wrote a note to Tony Blair to that effect. So it was kind of Easter time in 2002. There was beginning to be talk coming from the US that Iraq was very much on their radar. Certainly we became aware of planning meetings. By chance, those planning meetings were taking place, I think, roughly in the same building as the Afghanistan planning meetings. So although we weren't part of it initially, we knew that something was taking place. But as you say, my initial response was perhaps Iran was going to be a much bigger threat to the world than Iraq. And I still think that judgment was about right.
So let's look at the period leading up to the invasion. You say in the book that maybe too much importance has been ascribed to the meeting in Crawford, Texas, between George Bush and Tony Blair. Why do you think that? Because that, I think the common narrative now is that was the crucial meeting.
At the time, it did not seem to be that fundamental. There was in a sense, a process of working ever more closely together. I mentioned that there was some planning taking place in the United States already at CENTCOM. We were then invited to participate in that planning, and gradually there was an impetus developing. But I never ever felt that it was inevitable that we would be involved, partly because we had argued very strongly, as Tony Blair had argued, for the UN route and trying to find a second resolution that would have allowed a much broader coalition to participate. Equally, I also knew that we had to get a vote through the House of Commons, and that might not be straightforward. So, in a sense, my whole approach to this was always conditional. There were always a series of hurdles that we had to cross before actually we would be committed.
And as Defence Secretary, did you feel that you were involved all the time in all the important decisions? Because Tony Blair was quite famous for sofa government, wasn't he? And you relate an incident later on when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, where you felt that you were being completely excluded, but presumably in this, you were in the room.
Yes, I was. Although, again, the planning was across the board. Many people, probably rightly, have said that there was not enough aftermath planning, and that was certainly one of the conclusions of Chilcot. But I think I spent more time in meetings planning the aftermath than necessarily planning the military activity, because the military activity was managed very, very effectively by senior military figures. The planning for the aftermath, we did not have a group of people who were aftermath planners. And I have to concede that we planned for the wrong things. We did not anticipate the level of resistance and the problems that we faced in Iraq eventually. We were planning to make sure there was enough food because 60% of the Iraqi population had relied on UN food. We planned and succeeded in taking water from Kuwait, a place that precious little water, into the south of Iraq. So the things that we did seemed right at the time. I've got to accept that with the benefit of hindsight, they were the wrong things, but we spent a lot of time doing it.
But wasn't it predominantly the aftermath was such a disaster because the Americans took a lot of wrong decisions at that time?
Well, there were two key decisions that we were very unhappy about. One was the disbandment of the Ba'ath Party. Going back to the end of the Second World War, the British government at the time and the military authorities recognised that lots of people had joined the Nazi Party, not because they were enthusiasts for Hitler or his appalling ideology. They joined the Nazi Party because they wanted to be civil servants or teachers or public officials of some kind. And that was true of the Ba'ath Party. And I think the decision to disband the Ba'ath Party not only created enemies amongst people who lost their jobs and lost their livelihood, it also meant that we lost a whole group of people who could have managed Iraq as Iraqis rather than having to do that as a foreign occupation force. The second was the disbandment of the Iraqi army. And again, I think that was wrong because we had understood, even before the invasion, that Saddam Hussein was not entirely comfortable with many parts of his own military hierarchy. Indeed, the Republican Guard, his elite force, were never allowed into Baghdad because he didn't trust them. And we, in fact, at various stages in the fighting, held back from attacking parts of the Republican Guard simply because we thought, again, they would be a force for stability. Once they were dissolved and people lost their jobs in the military, they went to the dark side. And we were well aware that some of the explosive attacks, some of the organisation of the attacks on our forces were done with very significant military ability. And they were people who previously had probably opposed Saddam Hussein, but now equally opposed the occupying forces as they saw it.
Let's talk about the suicide of Dr. David Kelly, which I imagine was probably the most difficult bit in the book to write, or to write about. Just take us through events from your point of view. And there's one very poignant piece in the book where you meet this man in the old War Office, where you're decamped because the MOD was being renovated. And you went down to the canteen for a meal and ended up talking to this guy who turned out to be Dr. David Kelly, but you only knew that when you met his wife and family after he'd died. I mean, that in itself must have been quite a shock.
This was in the immediate period before the invasion, and I had been spending all weekend in London, obviously, as well as the rest of the week. And it was a Saturday evening. I think I'd got a private secretary. I don't think there were many other people around. I was working through some papers, and I was hungry, so I went downstairs. There was a very sort of impromptu cafe set up somewhere in the bowels of the old War Office building, and I went there, got something to eat, sat down, and started a conversation with someone who clearly was very knowledgeable about Iraq, about weapons of mass destruction. I mean, one of the things I remember vividly was him telling me that we were absolutely right to be doing what we were doing. And it was a great conversation from my point of view, because ministers can sometimes be overprotected. You know, having the opportunity of meeting someone on a Saturday evening in the building, having a chat without sort of preparation, without somebody saying, okay, well, it's time you moved on, Minister, was very welcome, and I enjoyed the conversation, although I had absolutely no idea at the time who it was. And as you say, it was only after his tragic suicide that I went to visit his wife and daughters, and they told me that he'd come back that Saturday evening full of enthusiasm, that he'd met the Secretary of State and told him what he thought, and they recounted to me the conversation. So that, as you say, was the first I'd heard of him.
So rolling back from that, when were you first aware that there was somebody who had gone to the media?
I think it was a Thursday evening. I think I'd been to some event, and I came back to the Ministry of Defence, and Sir Kevin Tebbit, the Permanent Secretary, told me that someone had come forward. I don't think I was given his name even at the time, and I wouldn't have known the name, not least because he wasn't actually a civil servant as such. He had been involved with the MOD, but was some sort of a contractor, not an employee in the full sense of the word. But even then, we were not entirely sure, because I don't think he felt at the time that he was necessarily the source of the quotation that was eventually used.
And where were you when you heard that he had taken his own life?
Again, I think I was in the MOD. It was a terrible shock to everyone, more than a shock. I mean,
but could you at that point even understand how big a event, how big a story this was going to be?
Oh, I think so. Yes, I realised, but it also made me realise something, which I hope also I've tried to set out in the book. Politicians and the political process, and journalists are part of this process. It is a very hard, demanding activity, and I think in a way it can be slightly corrosive. And I think we all get used to that because it's part of what you have to do to survive. We had put a man, a rather gentle, quiet man, into the forefront of public and political debate, and had not in any way whatsoever appreciated the impact that was going to have on him. A proud man, a man who, was an expert, was thoughtful, but instead of having the opportunity of being thoughtful and considered, as he, I'm sure, was in his working life, he was being hit by very primitive questions about ideas and motivation and what he'd done and what he hadn't done, and he just could not cope with it.
As we sit here nearly 20 years on from that, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories about what happened to him. Did he take his own life? Were there other dark forces involved? Are you still 100% certain that the story that we have, that he did take his own life, is the correct one?
I have never seen anything to suggest other than he took his own life. I went to see his family. As far as I'm aware, they accepted that. There was, in effect, a full public inquiry, which was in essence an inquest that took place, as you've observed, in a blaze of publicity. So I just have no doubt that if there was a fact or piece of evidence that proved something differently, then I would have seen it and we would be aware of it.
What was the process of making his name public?
I never really got to the bottom of what exactly happened, other than the fact that his name was around, people were aware of it, and essentially they put it to the press office in the MOD, who confirmed it. There was certainly no intention.
How did they confirm it? Did they have to come to you and say, "Do we confirm this?"
No, they
or
didn't,
not?
and I that's why I'm less than clear about how that happened, because I simply do not know what the process was, other than I think lots of people by then were aware of the name, and I think the press office in the MOD simply accepted that since so many people knew it, they would confirm it.
As you went to see his family, I mean, as you drove up to the house, what was going through your mind? Because it must have been one of the more harrowing events of your entire life, I would have thought.
I felt it was my duty to go. That may sound rather a heavy word to use in this context, but I felt that I needed to see them, to explain, as far as I was aware at the time, what had happened. Frankly, to apologise for the way in which he had been treated by the world, not just by the MOD. They were gracious, is the only word I can think of. They were absolutely remarkable in the way in which they managed the process, and my presence. I could well have understood that they might have been angry and resentful about my turning up on their doorstep. They were actually very, very generous, not only to me, but to the Prime Minister, to Alistair Campbell, and they specifically asked me to say so to both of them, which I did.
Something similar where I think it was somebody in Wales who had lost, I think there were an initial 10 deaths of British soldiers in Iraq, and one of the parents, I think you met at a function, am I right? Just take us through that, because I thought this was a very illustrative thing about how the system of government can appear sometimes inhumane to people.
No, I think that's a fair observation, but I need to go right back to the fact that, having lived in the United States, I was well aware of the way in which the United States marked the return of fatal casualties. They were marched down from an aircraft, soldiers stood to attention. There were full military honours accorded to someone who died in service. Whereas I had been told that when bodies were brought back from the Falkland Islands, they were brought back months later without any kind of recognition, and I thought that was wrong. So I insisted that, even before we faced the problem of casualties, that we should look at the way in which this was done and, in a sense, copy what the Americans had done. And therefore, when the first bodies came back, I was at Brize Norton to receive them on behalf of the government. We had also invited all of the families to attend. And after 2 or 3 hours of formality, we then went into a mess, a sergeant's mess, I think, where the families were sitting around tables. It was not an easy thing, and I still recall how uncomfortable I felt at that time, because these were people who only very recently had lost probably the most important person in their lives, their husband, fiancé, son, father. And I had to talk to them. And I didn't really have the words to do it. It was not something that I think anyone could prepare for. I'm made worse by the fact that one of the families, as you say, from Wales, told me that following their son's death, they had had letters of condolence from the local authority, from the Welsh executive, from a whole range of organisations, but they'd heard nothing from the government. And I was really shocked by that and went back very angry to the MOD to demand why this was the case, why no one from the military had thought fit to be in touch. And I think the answer, I never really got a satisfactory answer, but it was to do with history. It was to do with the numbers of deaths in the First and Second World War and the impossibility of providing that kind of 21st century approach, as opposed to perhaps one that was formed in the 19th century in days of mass casualties. So I insisted that this was done, and indeed I myself hand-wrote letters to every fatal casualty from then on to the end of my time in the MOD. Many of those people had died in road traffic accidents, but nevertheless it seemed the right thing to do.
Because I remember Margaret Thatcher did that in the Falklands War, and I think Tony Blair did a lot of it also for Afghanistan and Iraq. We're slightly running out of time. I'm looking at the clock, and I know I've got to do a pre-recorded interview in about 10 minutes' time. So I want to skim through a few quite important events now. 2005, Tony Blair tried to sack you as Defence Secretary, but you fought back.
Well, he did sack me as Defence Secretary.
Well, yes, he did. He did, but you got another job.
Well, I've often thought about that morning. The count in Ashfield was always very late, partly because there's quite a lot of rural, former coal mining areas, so it takes a while for the votes to come in and be counted. So I probably didn't get to bed till, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. And when the phone rang at 9 and it was the Prime Minister, I probably wasn't in the best of moods, if I'm absolutely honest. And my mood went sharply down when he told me that he no longer required my services in the government. So I was pretty irritated, and I told him so. He then very fairly said, well, let's have a chat about it, come round, and he, being London-based, hadn't appreciated that I was still in the East Midlands, so after a very, very fast car journey with my protection team down to London, I went into his office in Downing Street and saw on the screen that actually I was slated to be Leader of the House of Commons. So I clearly didn't argue any further. But
he wasn't a very good butcher, was he?
I don't think any Prime Minister particularly enjoys that process. The memoirs I've read, they all say, even Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, was supposed to hate the process of reshuffles. And it must be extremely difficult for Prime Ministers to say to people that their services are no longer required. And certainly there were a number of occasions that I'm aware of where people went into his office and came out thinking that they'd just been praised, only to be told that actually they'd just been sacked. So that perhaps is a measure. It's perhaps, at this distance and this remote, I think it's a measure actually of his kindness. I don't think he enjoyed the process of sacking people and wanted to let people down as gently as possible. Sometimes it's so gently that they didn't notice.
When Gordon Brown took over in 2007, he made you his chief whip, which didn't turn out very well for you in the sense that you felt constantly undermined by your number two, Nick Brown, who then became chief whip after you. And then you became transport minister. But you eventually came to realise that Gordon Brown wasn't the guy that many people had thought he was in terms of being prime minister. And you led with Patricia Hewitt, led a sort of an abortive coup attempt at the beginning of 2009. Now, you've got some fairly harsh words to say about Harriet Harman on this. In fact, I say you say some harsh words. I think you could have said some very harsh words, but you seem to have held back.
Well, I didn't say any harsh words.
Feel free to express them now.
Okay, well, going right back, and I think most members of the Cabinet, at the time that Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, thought he was the only choice. He seemed to bestride the Treasury. He seemed to be the right man in a crisis. Whenever we had policy discussions around the Cabinet table, he'd always got the strategy well thought through and outlined it, when the rest of us seemed to be, managing our departments and struggling sometimes in the process. So I had no doubt that he should be Prime Minister. What I hadn't appreciated, perhaps, was that in the Treasury he had only taken the really big decisions. He delegated much of the day-to-day stuff to people like Ed Balls and others who worked closely with him. And sadly, and I think it is a tragedy for a man of such considerable intellect, he appeared not to be able to deal with the day-to-day detail of being Prime Minister. And I often used to say to civil servants, particularly when I moved to a new department, that they didn't really need ministers other than to take the big decisions, because that's what they're there for. And in a sense, junior ministers take junior minister decisions. If they can't agree, they go to the cabinet minister. If cabinet ministers can't agree, inevitably the Prime Minister has to decide. So there's a constant process of work arriving on the Prime Minister's desk in Downing Street that he and only he can resolve. And Gordon Brown, sadly, could not deal with that process of taking those decisions. He wanted to look into every detail in order to reach a decision, and there just was not the time for that. And I think it is a tragedy. I think he had almost every other quality required, but for that ability to take decisions, which sadly actually is the fundamental quality required of a modern Prime Minister.
But Harriet Harman, who was deputy leader of the party at the time, senior cabinet minister, she effectively set you and Patricia Hewitt up to start this coup attempt and then ran at the first sign of gunfire.
Well, she called me one Saturday night. I think it was just before Parliament was due back in January, and said that if I and other senior figures were prepared to indicate that action should be taken to consider having a new leader of the Labour Party, then she and other members of the Cabinet would be behind that. I wasn't particularly keen on doing it on my own, and I'm pretty sure she gave me Patricia Hewitt's telephone number. I mean, Patricia and I were colleagues, but we weren't close friends particularly. I certainly didn't have her mobile phone number. It wasn't something you could go through a switchboard to do, and I called her, and she agreed, and we started the process on the Monday, I think, when we got back to Parliament. And I've never actually double-checked with Patricia. Perhaps I should have done, but as far as I'm aware, Harriet must have had a similar conversation with Patricia. I hadn't had the conversation. So the two of us then did invite members of Parliament to consider whether they wanted Gordon Brown to be leader. But it was not. It was not my finest moment. It was not something that I looked back on.
You basically went over the top and found that there was nobody following you.
Well, that's true. It wasn't very well organised, and I mean, the only consolation, in a sense, I have is that probably history proved me correct, but I remain deeply disappointed to this day that we did not have quite enough seats after the 2010 election to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. It would have been a much more natural political coalition than the one that was formed with the Conservatives. I think it would have been the start of something different in British politics. And I think we would have perhaps avoided many of the problems that Britain has faced since then.
So you left Parliament in 2010. They say there's nothing so ex as an ex-MP, and you didn't find it easy to find a new job. And then you had the Sunday Times Dispatch's sting operation, which, I mean, many people have been victims of sting operations, but that must have been a very, very uncomfortable experience.
I think it was one of the low points in my life, if I'm honest. I was not sleeping very well. I just felt that I'd let so many people down by being caught out in that way, and it also made it, well, at least for a while, it made it extremely difficult to get any of the jobs that either I'd been promised or I'd been talked about doing. Having said all of that, I did get through it. It wasn't a great period in my life. I was taken in, but at the same time, I probably said things that even in private I probably shouldn't have done. So I was fairly fortunate actually in getting what proved to be a hugely exciting and enjoyable job with Augusta Westland. I travelled the world selling helicopters as part of their very senior management team, and it just gave me a new lease on life. But certainly for a few months it was pretty grim.
You quote in the book the famous phrase, all political careers end in failure. Do you feel that your career ended in failure? Because if you do, I don't think you ought to.
Well, it's kind of you to say so. There have been times when I certainly felt like that, because I went to the House of Commons in 1992 full of idealism, enthusiasm. I say this against myself, slightly proud that I'd actually made it. And it was something...
Why not?
Something really important, and I left with this cloud over me of the sting of a terrible report by the Standards Committee, and I just felt that I had gone through a terrible process that, you know, in a sense I brought on myself, and there's nothing worse than feeling that, you know, you're the author of your own misfortune. So certainly there were times when I wondered whether it was worth it. Now, with the benefit of some distance, then it was worth it, and no one should feel that they had failed in public life.
And at no point did Elaine say, "I told you shouldn't have gone into politics."
Actually,
I don't know Elaine, but I know enough of what you write about her in the book to think she probably did.
Yeah, she's far too generous to say quite as categorically as that. But nevertheless, I was left in no doubt that, well, I think that was part of the problem. And it's part of the problem in a sense that I hope I try and address in the book. In a way, the book, someone asked me the other day, what's the target audience? And I think it's my 25-year-old self, or maybe a 25-year-old today, who's thinking, you know, I'd like to be a member of Parliament. I'd like that political career. And I think it's trying to demonstrate that actually this is a tough process. You should not go into this thinking this is all going to be wonderful and straightforward.
Well, Geoff, it's been an absolute pleasure. I hope everyone buys your book. It's called See How They Run, and it's out now.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And join us again next week. Goodbye.